afternoon. My name is Matthew Lipschitz, and I'm delighted to be joining you today to moderate a conversation with Chris Mosier. Firstly, I want to begin by thanking the Jewish Federation of Greater Rochester for inviting me. Having grown up in the Jewish community of Rochester, I am really proud to see the Levine Center engaging the broader community in crucial conversations about bias, hatred, and how we can collectively dismantle these systems of thought. A little about me: I am currently a student at Pace University in New York. I'm completing my BFA in dance and minoring in business. And as someone who has dedicated a lot of my life to pushing my own physical boundaries, I am so excited to have this opportunity to speak with someone like Chris, who is pushing more boundaries than just the physical. So without further ado, our Chris Mosier is the first transgender athlete to represent the United States in men's international competition, as well as the first transgender athlete to appear in the ESPN body issue and to be sponsored by Nike. Called the man who changed the Olympics by the BBC and the New York Magazine, Chris Mosier is a trailblazing athlete who made history in 2020 as the first transgender athlete to compete in the Olympic trials in the gender with which they identify. He has become one of the leading grassroots organizers against the current wave of anti-trans legislation across the United States, and he also mentors transgender and non-binary athletes around the world in hopes that he can live by his motto of "Be who you needed when you were younger." With that, welcome, Chris. We are so honored to have you here with us.
Thank you so much. I'm so thrilled.
Absolutely. So to begin, for the diverse perspectives who may be listening, I think it is helpful to start with some terminology and definitions. Of course, everyone navigates their own gender identity differently, but can you define the terms transgender and non-binary or non-conforming for our audience?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's the absolute right place to start, right? Because we can't begin to have conversations if we're not all using the same language. So I think language is the most key, most essential place to begin. Transgender, often shortened to trans, is an adjective. It is a term used to describe a person whose gender identity doesn't necessarily match their sex assigned at birth. And it's important to say that it is an adjective. So we say a transgender man, a trans woman, a trans athlete, and not a transgender or transgendered, which is a very common mistake that people make by putting an ED on transgender. I'm present tense. I am here with you right now. I am not past tense, so no ED necessary on transgender. The related term to that is cisgender. So cisgender refers to an individual whose gender identity aligns with the one typically associated with their sex assigned at birth. We all have a gender identity, just some of us don't have to think about it very often. And then the last term you said was non-binary. So non-binary is sometimes shortened to NB, which is written ENBY, and that's the phonetic spelling of NB for non-binary. Non-binary refers to individuals who identify as either maybe as neither a man or a woman, or both man and woman, or a combination of man and woman, thinking about gender more on a spectrum as opposed to our two check boxes, which is what we often find in sports, which is what makes these conversations so challenging. Non-binary is under the trans umbrella, so some people who identify as non-binary may also identify as transgender, but some may not. Some may use the term non-binary exclusively. And non-binary and gender diverse are the more preferred terms. Non-conforming really assumes that there is a quote-unquote normal or typical way for people to conform to gender standards. And we're trying to move away from that idea that it's locked into the binary, or that there's just one way to be a man or one way to be a woman. And we know that that's not true. There's not one way to be a man. There's not just one way to be a woman. There's not one way to be a trans person or a non-binary person either. So, thinking about gender on a spectrum is the best way that we can approach this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that, and for also making the distinction of my use of the word non-conforming. So yeah, as you obviously know, you are a 6-time member of Team USA, and you are a competitive triathlete and a duathlete. I personally thought that as an athlete and a dancer, my body could not take much more than this one sport, but here you are defying gravity a little bit. So yeah, will you define these terms, triathlete and duathlete, for us as well?
Yes, good. It's a good question. So let's continue with the terminology. Duathlete is the one that usually catches people. Triathlon is swim, bike, run. It is one single sport that incorporates all three things done back to back to back, with short transitions in between. And the races can be very short, so like a sprint triathlon, all the way up to the Ironman distance, which is something that people have typically heard of, which is a 2.4-mile swim, 112-mile bike, and a full marathon run at the end. So that is triathlon. Duathlon is run, bike, run. And so it is, again, a 3-segment event, but it is a run and then a bike and then a run back to back to back. For me, I just found that I am a better runner than I am a swimmer. And so I shifted over to duathlon shortly after my sort of multi-sport career started, but still do triathlons as well.
Incredible. I actually had the opportunity to volunteer at an Ironman race in Lake Placid a few years ago, which was such an incredible opportunity to see the athletes there. It was wild. But yeah, as amazing as it is to be a duathlete and a triathlete, it amazes me to say that you are the first openly transgender man on Team USA and are credited with being the catalyst for the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, to change its policy on transgender athletes. It is an understatement to say that that is an incredible accomplishment. Can you walk us through how you engaged with the IOC and how you advocated in the face of adversity to help make this possible?
Yeah, I think it is probably good to go back a little bit of like when I first came out and started competing in the men's category. So, 2008, 2009, I was just starting to understand my gender identity. And I was living in New York City, in Manhattan at the time, and I literally did not know another trans person in real life. And so, I like kind of just gave me chills to think about that, because so much of my experience now and what I want to do, as you mentioned in the intro, is to be the person that I needed when I was younger. I want to be that role model, that representation for people who have either never seen a trans person play sports, never met a transgender man before, don't have experiences with the trans community. So, my coming out process was really difficult in sports. And so I was accustomed to facing the barriers of not being able to participate, of trying to change my category in New York City races and coming up against not really blatant discrimination, but more of a lack of understanding about, one, what it meant for me to be transgender, and two, how sports organizations could, quote unquote, accommodate an athlete like me. And I do the air quotes because I don't want to be accommodated. I want to be welcomed and accepted and embraced as the athlete that I am, and that I think all people should be. So by the point of 2015, I had been starting to win some races in the men's category. I went to the national championship race and placed, I think, 7th in that race, which allowed me a spot on Team USA. And when I got that information that I received a spot, I knew right away that I would not be eligible to participate in the World Championship race because of the current International Olympic Committee policy for trans athletes. It was much more restrictive in terms of a hormone wait time for athletes, as well as a requirement for surgery. And so they were saying at that time that every transgender athlete needed to undergo a full lower surgery, internal and external genital modification, in order to play sports. And my goal in challenging them was just to open up the door for other athletes. I knew that I was a name and a face of a person who had qualified just like every other athlete. And, I could challenge them on that because they finally had somebody who was going to use the policy. So I engaged with lawyers, and fortunately they did a lot of the heavy lifting and the hard work of representing me. And, they were able to convince them to change that policy. So they reduced the hormone wait time for transgender women from 2 years to 1 year. They fully eliminated the wait time for transgender men, meaning that there's no requirement of taking hormones for a trans man. A trans man could participate in the men's category without restriction. And then they completely eliminated the surgery requirement, deeming it a human rights violation, saying no athlete should have to modify their body in order to play sports. And the great thing about that, and the reason this was so significant and such a win for me, aside from the fact that I did get to go to the World Championship race and compete internationally as the first trans athlete to do that, but it really helped create a foundation for other policies in the future to eliminate that surgery requirement. So, getting that policy changed in 2015 helped to wipe out the requirement that athletes modify their bodies. Now, there are a few organizations that are holdovers from that old policy, but for the most part, organizations updated and adopted the new IOC policy. So it was really a huge win for trans athletes around the world.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely incredible. I know you know, and I hope you know how absolutely significant and inspirational that is to so many young athletes, especially, and to everyone. And going off of that a little bit, you were featured in an article in Rolling Stone where you noted that your sports heroes have always been those who, on top of their athletic brilliance and performance, have really fought for and ushered in real social change. With that said, can you speak to how impactful it must be for young trans athletes to have a role model like yourself today, especially when you didn't necessarily grow up with that same representation?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can't speak to that point, but I do hope that that's the case, right? Like the goal is that athletes be able to see me and know that they can be their authentic self and continue to play the sports that they love and not have to compromise any part of their identity. And I know, looking back on my experience, not only did I not know a trans person in real life, I didn't really know them on the internet either, and I didn't see trans people in sports. And so I'm not the first trans athlete to ever compete, but there was a large gap between Renee Richards participating in women's tennis in the 70s and myself coming out in 2010. And I had never seen transgender men participate with men. And so, there were a couple of barriers that I was really focused on breaking down and just allowing people to see that you can participate in what you love and that there is a space for trans people in sports. And I think that's the biggest thing. Like, I wonder, and I often think about how my life would have been different if I would have seen somebody like me at a younger age, if I would have known that it was possible to be trans. Like, I always laugh when I do terminology sections of trainings and things that I do, because I always say, you don't know what you don't know, right? You don't know what you don't know. But once you do know it, you if you knew better, you'd do better, right? Like once you know it, you have to do better with that. But as a trans person, I literally didn't know that trans was an identity until I was an adult. And so more than a joke, because the experiences that I had when I was younger was watching trans people in the media, and the media portrayal of trans people. And if anybody hasn't seen the documentary Disclosure, I definitely recommend watching Disclosure on Netflix. Watching Disclosure and not the other thing on Netflix that's getting a lot of controversial information about the trans community right now, to see how the trans community has been covered in the last century. My information as a trans person came from Jerry Springer and Maury Povich. It came from trashy movies where trans people were the butt of a joke, or they were murdered, or there was some sort of violence against the trans community. And so, seeing that, and particularly seeing a lot of trans women and not trans men, I didn't know that I was possible. And so all of the role models that I had who were working towards social justice and creating change using sports as their platform really informed how I wanted to use my platform and my experience to educate people about the trans community, to uplift other people who are in my community but don't necessarily have the platform, and then also to use my website to create a platform for other experiences to be shared that aren't mine. So as a white trans man, my experience is very different than my peers who are people of color and who are trans, or specifically trans women of color in sports and in life. And so having a platform, being an athlete, gives me the opportunity to lift other people's voices and to speak about how I'm seeing discrepancies in the way that I'm treated versus the way that trans women are treated, and so on. So, drawing those inspirations from those role models that I had, even though none of them were transgender, they were social justice advocates and activists for change. And I think that that's the most important piece for me, because as much as I love participating in sport, I love the platform that it allows me to uplift the trans community and the LGBTQ plus community as well. And so I always joke, like, I'm going to continue to do sports until I can no longer move, because I love I love the access to the platform that it gives me, because they go hand in hand. I think sport is a vehicle for social change, and we can use sport to create change in our little community that ripples out into, like, to the fans, and then from the fans to the dinner table, and then into the workplace. And so I just think there's such a huge opportunity for athletes to use that position, and that's really what I aspire to do.
Yeah, incredible. I think speaking more on using sports as a vehicle for social change, I'd love to give you a moment to talk about your founding of Trans Athlete, and what you aspire to do with your platform.
Yeah, thank you. Transathlete.com. So it's singular, one athlete, transathlete.com, all one word, is just a resource for sports leagues, organizations, athletes, coaches, fans to get more information about trans inclusion in sports at various levels of play. And I really founded it in 2013. So now we're going on over 8 years of tracking policies. And, it's been incredible to watch the change happen. And, I feel very hopeful for the change that will come, despite all of the bad things happening in legislatures across the country, despite the political push and politicization of trans identities, and particularly trans kids. I feel so hopeful that we will use sport as this vehicle for change, for embracing and uplifting the trans community and non-binary athletes. I made the website because of that experience that I had when I was coming out of, emailing an organization and saying, "Hey, I'm trans. I want to change my category. How do we go about doing that?" And that person saying, "Oh, I don't know, but I'll forward you on to 8 of my colleagues, and maybe somebody here knows." And then those people forward me on, and suddenly I am outed to 47 people at a local sports organization, and, feeling really vulnerable, and like no one can help me. And so I wanted to have that hub, that resource where anybody could go to look to see what's a good policy, what's a bad policy, how do I make a policy, how do I change my policy, and what's comparable. And so it tracks the 50 states for high school policies. It tracks professional and recreational policies, collegiate policies. And then the biggest shift, I think, that has happened in the last 2 years is that it's really become a place where we're mobilizing to fight against the legislation that's happening across the country. Just last year, we saw the introduction of the first trans athlete bill that got passed into law right before everything shut down for COVID-19. And that was in Idaho. And then this year we've had 8 states, and moving quickly in Texas as well, that have actually passed anti-trans sports bills to ban young people from playing sports with their friends. And so transathlete.com has really become a resource for people in fighting back against that, to get people involved in speaking up and supporting transgender youth across the country, whether they live in these states or not. And I think that's really important, because this legislation has been introduced in 34 states in our country. And while we defeated it largely in most of them, there were still states that created laws to ban trans kids from playing sports with their friends. And, the reason I'm so passionate about this is that I think sports is just the gateway, unfortunately. The way that lawmakers have been introducing and fighting for these anti-trans sports bills, despite there being no problems with trans youth participating with their peers across the country, has really just shown that it is targeting us, the trans community, in an attempt to keep us out of public life. We've seen these sports bills be packaged with bills that would prevent transgender youth from accessing safe and affirming healthcare. We've seen it packaged with bills that would turn against the parents for loving and supporting their trans child and deem that child abuse to affirm a young person's gender. We've seen it targeting school curriculums and counselors and supportive teachers. And then we've also seen it accompanying bills that would either prevent trans people from changing their birth certificates or the gender marker on their ID. And you can see how these all fit together, because targeting kids then moves into targeting the adults, which then moves into making sure that I can't safely get on an airplane or access housing or apply to a job in a comfortable way. And it really is the attempt to silence and oppress and keep trans people out of our society. So, I think that cutting it with sports and standing up for kids is obviously the right thing to do. And I think that that's it. We can't really argue against that. Like, I want every kid to feel safe and welcome and accepted and embraced in school. And I think that's something that everybody can relate into. And that's, the reason why I think fighting the sports bills is so incredibly important in the big picture for trans equality and transgender justice.
Yeah, you are truly doing the work, and I'm grateful to hear more about how, what you are doing for young athletes. Like you said, they are being affected by the politicization of something that truly has nothing to do with their identity and nothing to do with their worth, and that, I have chills thinking about the good that you are doing for them right now.
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. Bridging off of that, you must be summoning this courage and this, like, from somewhere, because I feel like you are giving so much of of yourself there. You are not expected to be the face of trans representation in sports, yet here you are, knowing that you do have this opportunity and this platform. And so I guess what I'm asking you is, what moments over these past few years that you've been out, or just that have kind of fueled you to keep going and have inspired you to say that there is hope and that you do see such a light at the end of this for trans youth?
Yeah, I think the courage lives in the tips of my mustache. That's where this was a COVID-19. This is a pandemic mustache that actually ended up just turning out really, really nicely. So I always have to make a mustache joke. But yeah, where does the courage come from? I think, it comes from personal experience, and it comes from remembering those feelings of isolation and loneliness, like literally back to the time when I was 4 years old. The first time that I remember my aunt pulling me around the back of the house saying, "Hey, you can't run around with your shirt off. Little girls don't run around with their shirt off." And I was 4 years old looking at the other 4-year-old bodies around me going, I don't understand. And like all of those moments where I was policed on my gender, where I was corrected about how I wore a hat, or, what sports I was attracted to, or what music I listened to, or how I walked, or how I gestured, all of those things, I can replay all of those moments and recall all of the pain that I felt in those moments. And I think my drive, my desire now comes from a place of not wanting any young person to have to experience that, and not wanting any parent to wonder if their child will be okay because they are expressing themselves in a certain way. I want, parents and teachers and coaches to know that it does more good to support a young person in their identity than to try to change them. That I really believe that parents specifically have two options if they have a trans or non-binary child: that they can have a dead child or they can have a trans child. And they can have a child who's no longer in their life, or they can love and accept and embrace and support and uplift their child. And I would like to hope that that would be the route that everyone would go. But I know that that's not the case. And I know that's not the case for a variety of reasons. And again, pulling this back to disclosure, pulling this back to the messages that we receive from media and TV and movies, pulling this into the way that lawmakers are currently talking about the trans community right now, and the way that they had been for the 4 years prior administration, right? Speaking about us while misgendering us, or while saying that we are, deceptive or not being honest or forthcoming about our identity, that the weaponization of biology in how people talk about us and address us, all of these things, whether bills become law or not, every single conversation that happens in a state house where people are being misgendered or told that they are lying about their identity has a negative impact on the trans community. It has a negative impact on our allies. And so, I think that my purpose, my mission in being here, the reason I am on this planet, I think, is to be an educator and to use my experience because, like I said about the IOC policy change, I know that I was able to get that policy changed because I was a name and a face and an athlete who was facing, using this policy. But I don't know, and I'm upset to say this, I don't know that it would have been the same outcome had it been a transgender woman who was challenging the policy versus me. And I don't know that it would have been the same outcome if it was, a person from the global South or a trans person of color versus it being a white trans man. And I recognize that that is horribly wrong, and the intersections of our identity play in to every situation that we encounter and every policy outcome and rule and law. And so because I have been given and inherited this privilege of being perceived as a straight white man, I feel like I have a responsibility to use that position to try to make it easier for everyone in my community, as well as our allies.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. I think you're succeeding a millionfold in your mission so far. I can speak. Yeah. I think, referring back to athletes, something I also, hold on, I'm so sorry, I'm going to put a pin in that. Wanted to remind the audience that if they do have any questions, they are encouraged and welcome to submit anything that they would like to know, respectfully, of course. But yes, in terms of athletes, I'm wondering if, like, based on your experience or conversations that you may have had with other athletes, do athletes in team sports settings have a different experience than athletes such as yourself who are in more of a solo sport situation? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. So do athletes in team sports have a different situation than athletes in solo sports? Absolutely. And, it's been really interesting for me, particularly as a runner and as a triathlete. And I would say runner first because I came into triathlon and duathlon as a runner. That running has really been the center point, the focal point of this battle of trans inclusion in sports. And it has also been one of the areas that has been leading the way in being more inclusive by comparison to other sports and organizations. So we've seen the individuals competing in running races are often brought up and in the legislative sessions, in the battle, in this conversation about transgender athletes. And this is largely because there have been high profile cases of transgender athletes who are runners. So we had our two athletes in Connecticut, Terry Miller and Andrea Yearwood, who I have to give a plug here quickly, are both in the documentary Changing the Game on Hulu. I am an executive producer of this incredible documentary that follows four young transgender athletes in high school, two of them being the runners in Connecticut, and goes through just their process of being a high school student and being a transgender athlete. And I think it's one of the best ways to humanize and really see the experience of transgender athletes. So please do watch that on Hulu, Changing the Game. But yeah, I think, in terms of team sports, team sports are interesting because team sports policies have a little bit more wiggle room to be more inclusive, and yet we haven't really seen that happen. We're starting to get more professional sports teams, professional sports leagues to create policies. One just came out this week that I'm thrilled with that has meaningful inclusion for non-binary athletes in professional sports. Very, very cool policy. But I think that sport is just so interesting because it really depends on the type of sport, the level of play, where it's being played, and if it's individual or team sports. And that's all of those factors really go into what a policy looks like for inclusion. And we know that one athlete on a team will not make a team win or lose, right? I mean, one athlete could maybe make a team lose, but it would be hard to, even the most dominant player in team sports cannot carry a team to victory every single time. And so that's why I say I think that there's more room for inclusion in team sports. Now, when you're going head to head with people, that's where, that's why running, I think, is the sport that has received kind of the most criticism, as well as seeing races now starting to make really inclusive policies for the trans community and non-binary athletes. And I think that that's really important to call out. Like, while my website is transathlete.com, I'm thrilled to say that I'm launching nonbinaryathlete.com in the coming month, which will have policies for non-binary athletes and just be a place where those folks know that sport is for them as well. And I think that in the future, as we're looking forward to like what's next, I don't fully believe that people have a grasp on transgender people, and that's pretty evident from the legislatures across the country. But that said, I do think that considering and creating pathways for inclusion for non-binary athletes is really the next frontier, as we have more and more young people understand their gender identity to be something other than cisgender, and more people feeling aligned with non-binary identity.
Yeah, firstly, congratulations on now setting up nonbinaryathlete.com too as well. That is incredible. I think as someone who's involved in theater too, I think that there are steps that are being made right now towards non-binary inclusion in the arts, and it's so beyond over and important that everyone feels as though they have a safe place, whether they are in theater or sports or academia, anywhere. And yeah, I think going off of that a little bit, so many activities are separated by gender kind of inherently in our society. And for those NB folks, non-binary, for anyone who is learning that now alongside me, how have you seen these people be able to engage with their peers in the same way that cisgender people do, without being mislabeled or harmed or discriminated against? If you have.
Yeah, it's definitely a work in process, right? And Matthew, I think like you have such an interesting experience too, I think, to add to this, because I'm thinking back to my time working at Marymount Manhattan College in New York City, which is a school with a large theater and dance department. And I was hearing things from the students saying like there were certain roles that you could try out for, and there are certain roles that you couldn't audition for because of your assignment at birth. There were certain roles in dancing that were assigned to you, like, and then there were certain things that you couldn't do because of your assignment at birth. So people assigned female at birth were not lifting other dancers, or, and I'm sure you can think of examples of this as well, but we see that sport and performance have really had these hard lines of a binary, even though people don't neatly fit into these two categories. So the challenge with sports really is that there are two categories in sports. And for people who fall outside of the two categories of male or female, or want to express themselves differently, whether they identify as non-binary or not, it's really a tough choice to have to, and this is what the policy is largely for non-binary people as a default, is that you just have to choose one or the other. You have to choose a category and then stick with it. And oftentimes, non-binary athletes are forced to choose the category of their assignment at birth as a default. That doesn't necessarily fit for everyone, and that doesn't necessarily feel safe or comfortable for every athlete. And so I think sports organizations are really trying to understand right now what are the options for us, because, I can say I've actually become a stronger feminist by transitioning to be a trans man. And I think part of this is that when I was being perceived as female, I didn't want that label associated with me. So I was, I think internally, I was not vocal to other people about standing up for women's rights because I didn't want to be assumed to be a woman. And so I think in transitioning to be a man, that I have now become a stronger advocate for opportunity for women. And I think one of the things that we're seeing right now is that people are putting trans inclusion in sport against cisgender women in sport, and that saying that trans people and the inclusion of trans people and non-binary people will be the end of women's sports. It will be taking away opportunities from cisgender women. And that's simply not true. And so, I think I feel like a stronger advocate for making sure that, I don't think the answer is to eliminate gender categories altogether. Women fought very hard for their opportunities, and in at least our parents' lifetime, having Billie Jean King trying to create opportunities, Title IX trying to create opportunities for women in sports. And I think that's incredibly important, and we don't have to look any further than the discrepancies of today is the game 4 for the WNBA finals. I was fortunate enough to go to game 3 and watch my Chicago team take the lead, so hopefully we will win today. But people aren't really talking about it, and it doesn't get the same media coverage, and it doesn't get the same press, and we don't see the after game parties. And I don't even know what channel it's actually on TV today, and this is the championship game. And so there are so many discrepancies already with supporting and uplifting women's sports. When we introduce the inclusion of transgender and non-binary people try to put that against all of that work that was done for women in sports. And it doesn't have to be that way. So, I think right now we're just at this point where there's not a clear answer about what is the best practice for inclusion for trans and non-binary people. Policies at the Olympic level, policies for professional sports where the goals are very different, where there is money and gold medals and national championships and things like that, are obviously different than high school and middle school policies where the goal is to have people participate with their friends and to learn the values that people learn from playing sports. Like every good thing that I love about me in terms of my value set and my core values and understanding of the world came from playing sports as a kid. And every young person, regardless of their gender identity, should have that opportunity to learn those things.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think if we shift gears a little bit, we do have some more audience questions that are coming up, but I think we can end with a couple of those, which would be great. I think it must be acknowledged that the intersectionality, like you've spoken about, the intersectionality of identifying with different minority groups subjects an individual to heightened discrimination and associated violence, period. Unfortunately, 2021 is on track to being the deadliest year in the United States for trans people. In just this year alone, at least 38 transgender people have been killed, the majority of whom were Black and Latinx transgender women. I say at least because these stories too often go misreported or unreported entirely. As our society sort of approaches and navigates these vital conversations, literally about life or death, as you said, we must remember that these individuals proudly carried with them so many identities in conjunction with being trans. They were loving partners, parents, friends, siblings, community members, and whose contributions to society were and are enormous. And it is clearly overdue for society to contribute right back to them. So with that said, my question for you is there anything that we can do as a society to ensure that transgender people are protected and uplifted and alive at the end of the day?
Yeah, I think there are so many things, but the basis of this is education. I think that when people believe that they don't know a trans person, it becomes a lot easier to play into the myths and stereotypes and misconceptions that are being largely driven by the media, by lawmakers, by people who don't like trans people. And so, I think getting the basic understanding of terminology and of concepts is essential. And a great way to do this is, as I mentioned, watching Disclosure on Netflix, watching Changing the Game on Hulu, to really see that trans people are people. And, I'm so grateful that you brought that up, Matthew. I think that, we are loving partners, and we do have jobs, and we do have friends and family and our community members, and so many other pieces of our identity. When we die, we often see trans people being misgendered in their obituaries or in stories about themselves. And it really, to me, is the, sort of the biggest middle finger to be misgendered in death. Like, it's just heartbreaking. And it's heartbreaking to read these stories, to see the continued perpetual violence against our community, and specifically against Black and brown trans people and Indigenous trans people as well. And, I think the biggest thing, aside from remembering that we are people, is to have conversations that help us unpack our bias. One of the best things that I like to do, and I think Netflix is Disclosure is a great tool for this, is really to unpack where these messages came from that we learned from way, way back that inform how we view and treat trans people today. So I think I would really encourage allies specifically to think, what were the earliest messages that you got about trans people? Where did they come from? Who told you? And were they positive or negative? Because we carried that with us today. And I know that I, for 20 years of my life, carried with me the images from Jerry Springer and Maury Povich of people being accused of lying, fights breaking out, violence against our community because someone shared their truth with another person. And that certainly informed the way that I saw myself and my potential for existing as a trans person. There is a lot of, ideas of violence and trauma against our community. And it's important to say that because I think, in my expression and in my sharing of both my story, online in articles and on Instagram, and Twitter, where I do most of my social media, has really been one of trans joy and of like trying to uplift people. And while I'm fighting against legislation, while I'm fighting against oppressive, sort of content and people trying to ban us from playing sports, for example, I try to do it from a place of joy, I guess, to say like our experience is not all trauma and drama, and I think people love to play into that narrative. But when we see in the media, when we see negative reactions to trans people being, violence in movies or even bullying being made fun of. And this is, just to bring this to current events, this is why the Netflix special, The Closer from Dave Chappelle, is such a hot topic of information right now, because he says things that are against the trans community, that are violent against the trans community. And that, people don't know the trans people that Dave Chappelle knows. People aren't going to come for Dave Chappelle. They're going to take out their myths and misinformation on the trans person that they meet on the street. And so there is very real connections to comedy specials and to people making jokes on TV or in the media or even on social media, to equating to that very real violence against the trans community that often targets people who don't look like me. And so I think that it's, most helpful for us to unpack where we got this information from, to question the source, question the source of this information. So many of the articles that are out right now about trans people never quote a trans person. So you will read 90% of the articles about transgender athletes will never speak to someone in the trans community, one of our allies, or a trans person playing sports. So question the source that you get your information, and then have conversations using those films that I mentioned as starting points.
Incredible. Thank you so much for that insight. Yeah, I think you're right. Directing people towards the content that you said on Hulu, as opposed to some other stuff we've seen on Netflix recently, is extremely important. And education is definitely the bedrock of how we are going to spread joy and empathy and respect among people. Absolutely. I think, shifting gears a tiny bit somewhere else, there has been some lovely coverage of your relationship with your wife and her support in your transitioning. Do you want to share a little bit about your story with that? Of course, you don't have to, but if you would like to.
Yeah, I mean, since you asked, we just celebrated 9 years of being married, and this next month we will be celebrating 20 years of being together, which is incredible because I'm such a spring chicken. So to think that's been to say that she has been an essential part of my life would be an understatement, but her understanding as a cisgender woman of identity and of LGBTQ topics was just so much broader than my understanding. And so, the greatest thing that she did as both my ally and as a support person in my life was to give me space to come to my understanding of my identity in my own time, by giving me resources and encouraging me to speak with people, to go to therapy, which was awesome, to really consider not what I expected or not what I thought other people expected of me, but to really dive into what would make me happy. How can I show up the best and the most authentic in this world, even though we both knew it would be challenging. It was challenging for the way that people perceived our relationship, the expectations people put on her of thinking that she should feel a certain way. How did she feel? She felt thrilled that I have sort of blossomed into a person who can really confidently show up in this world and do good. So yeah, she's just been incredible, and I love I do have a pretty private life, like despite being very public. My relationship is private. That's for me, but her support, I think, can inspire people in the trans community to know that trans people are worthy of love and that we can have awesome relationships, and that that just because you're trans doesn't mean you will never date or that you will never find your person. And I think that that's really inspiring for people to see.
Yeah, shout out therapy and having an incredible support system and being a support system for someone else. That's crucial. Yeah, okay. In conclusion, you have said that your story is what it is today because you can stand at that starting line. And I will add that at that line, you are representing the best of who you are and the best of who this country is, truly. So for all of us who are standing at our own starting lines in life, or even midway through the race, what is your call to action to all of us at today's event?
Be where your feet are. We all have a different starting line, and whether you are well on your way of allyship to the trans and non-binary community and the LGBTQ plus community, or you are just inspired today to step up and toe that line for the first time, I encourage you to know that allyship is a process, and that there's not just as there's not just one way to be a trans man or a trans woman or a non-binary person or a cisgender person. There's not just one way to be an ally, and that relationship that you have with allyship can change and grow and evolve. And so I encourage you to embrace that journey and to take your first step. And then for every trans person out there, I would just say, never limit your own greatness to make other people feel more comfortable.
Oh my God, absolutely. I want to reiterate what you said. The trans community is absolutely worthy of love. Amplify that, say that a trillion more times. I want to so much for taking the time to speak with us today and your perspective. On behalf of the Jewish Federation, we are so grateful to have had you here and hope to speak with you again in the future. Thank you, truly.
Thank you so much.
Of course. I think I'm being told that I am introducing the co-chairs of the Levine Center to End Hate at the Jewish Federation of Greater Rochester. Unclear on their names as of right now, but I'm sure that will come through. Thank you so much for listening. And I know we touched briefly upon allyship, but as someone who is cisgender, I think it is so important to make sure that you are researching and doing the work yourself to know how you can be the best ally, and not necessarily always asking someone who is trans how you can be that ally. Sometimes, yes, if it's the appropriate situation, but it is not always on the trans community to educate us on that. We are so lucky to have had Chris with us and be so gracious enough to offer his insight and input. But it is really on all of us to do this work together and amplify empathy. Yeah, I have been given the names of the co-chairs. They are Carolyn Nussbaum and Keford. So thank you so much again for listening. And yeah, have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you to Matthew. Thank you to Chris. Again, good afternoon. I'm Carolyn Nussbaum, partner at Nixon Peabody and one of the co-chairs of the Levine Center to End Hate.
And I'm Kevin Beckford, the Senior Vice President and Chief People Officer for Grid Health, and the other co-chair of the Levine Center to End Hate. And just thank you for being with us today.
And I want to begin by thanking our keynote speaker, Juju Chang, and our closing speaker, Chris Mosier, and our moderator, Matthew, and all of our panelists, our workshop facilitators, and our moderators.
We want to thank our sponsors today, JP Morgan Chase, M&T Bank, Nixon Peabody, Trillium Health, and Excellus Blue Cross and Blue Shield. Without your sponsorship, we would not be able to bring this program to you today. And one of the things that's extremely important to us here at the Levine Center to End Hate is one of our key mission is to educate, dialogue, and to create positive action. And one barrier we want to make sure we never have is financial. And so to be able to have this program, have you attend today free of charge is really important to us. So our sponsors, we deeply appreciate your commitment to this work.
And thanks to all of you who took your time on a Sunday for your participation in today's summit. We all share today more than ever the common desire and the need to actively work together, to innovate, to collaborate, to listen, to learn, to eradicate hate from our lives and from our community.
Please be sure to give us your feedback. This is extremely important to us. Your feedback last year helped us to create the program that you see here today. And so please take some time when you're done with the program today to fill out that survey, and also to look forward to joining us for upcoming programs. Our website is endhaterock.org. I'll spell that for you. It's endhateroc.org. Extremely important. If you go there, you can sign up to get information when we have programs. We don't just have this program once a year. We have additional programs throughout the year. If you're really motivated today by wanting to take action, which is one of our hopes, is to either in your personal space where you are, whether it be at work or in your community, or if you'd like to volunteer. We're always looking forward to having volunteers to deepen our connection with the community. And so we hope that you're able to join us for future programs. And just thank you for being with us today and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.